Imagine waking up one morning to discover that someone you trusted, someone who once claimed to love you unconditionally, has spent months, perhaps years, systematically dismantling your sense of reality. Not with violence or obvious cruelty, but with something far more insidious: the slow, methodical erosion of your ability to trust your own perceptions. You felt it building for weeks now. That strange sensation when conversations end and you walk away feeling confused, as if the ground beneath your feet has shifted imperceptibly. Words that seemed clear moments ago now feel twisted, their meanings slipping through your fingers like water. You find yourself questioning memories that once felt solid, wondering if perhaps you're the one who's been wrong all along. But something has changed. You've grown stronger. You've learned to recognize the patterns, to see through the carefully constructed maze of manipulation. You've developed what Carl Jung might call conscious awareness, that rare and precious ability to observe the observer, to step outside yourself and see the game being played. And this terrifies them, because here's what most people don't understand about narcissists. They don't just fear abandonment or rejection. They fear something far more fundamental. They fear being truly seen. And when they encounter someone who has developed the strength to see clearly, who can no longer be easily manipulated or controlled, they deploy their most desperate and dangerous weapon. It's not rage, though that may come. It's not the silent treatment, though they may try that too. It's something far more sophisticated, something that strikes at the very core of your newfound strength. They attempt to make you question not just your memories or your perceptions, but your right to have grown stronger at all. Picture this. You finally found your voice. After months or years of walking on eggshells, of second-guessing every word, of shrinking yourself to fit their narrow definition of acceptable behavior, you've discovered something remarkable: your own inner compass. You've learned to trust your intuition, to recognize when something feels wrong, to say no without drowning in guilt. And then, just when you think you've escaped their gravitational pull, they sense your strength. Like a predator detecting the scent of confidence, they recognize that their old tactics no longer work. The gaslighting that once left you spinning in confusion now bounces off your awareness like rain on glass. The emotional manipulation that once sent you scrambling to repair damage you never caused now meets the solid wall of your self-respect. This is when they reveal their final card, the one they've been holding in reserve, waiting for exactly this moment. It's a manipulation so subtle, so perfectly calibrated to your specific vulnerabilities, that it can shake even the strongest foundation. They don't try to convince you that you're wrong about the past. Instead, they try to convince you that your growth itself is the problem. They whisper with wounded eyes and trembling voice that you've become cold, distant, unrecognizable. They mourn the person you used to be, the one who was so much more understanding, so much more willing to see their side, so much more flexible. They paint your strength as cruelty, your boundaries as walls, your clarity as delusion. But why does this final manipulation cut so deep? Why does it feel different from all the others? Why do even the strongest among us sometimes find ourselves wavering, wondering if perhaps we've gone too far, if our journey towards self-respect has somehow transformed us into the very thing we despise? The answer lies in a place most of us would rather not look, in the shadow spaces of our own psyche, where our deepest fears about ourselves lie waiting. Because this last manipulation doesn't just attack what we've become, it attacks our fundamental right to become anything at all. What happens when the person who once controlled your reality suddenly claims that your freedom from their control is itself a form of madness? What happens when they don't just question your memories, but your very right to heal from the damage they've caused? The stakes have never been higher. Your strength has never been more important, and their desperation has never been more dangerous. To understand why this final manipulation cuts so deep, we must venture into the labyrinthine depths of human psychology, where the narcissist's behavior isn't just personal pathology, it's a manifestation of something far more universal and terrifying: Carl Jung understood this when he wrote about the shadow, that part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, the aspects of our personality that we project onto others rather than confront within ourselves. The narcissist's terror of your strength isn't just about losing control over you. It's about confronting the shadow of their own weakness, their own desperate need for validation, their own crushing fear of being ordinary. But here's where it gets disturbing. They've learned to weaponize this very human tendency towards self-doubt. They've discovered that the strongest people often carry the deepest wounds around their right to be strong. Think about it. Those who've had to fight hardest for their strength are often the most suspicious of it, the most likely to wonder if they've somehow become the villain in their own story. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us about this in his exploration of master and slave morality. The narcissist operate from what he called slave morality. They cannot create value themselves, so they must destroy value in others. When they see your strength, they don't just want to diminish it. They want to convince you that strength itself is morally suspect. They whisper that your boundaries are selfishness, that your clarity is coldness, that your refusal to be manipulated is itself a form of cruelty. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. They're not just attacking your actions or your memories. They're attacking your right to have grown beyond their reach. They've identified the precise point where your strength intersects with your compassion, where your healing intersects with your humanity, and they drive their weapon straight into that intersection. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that we often hurt most those we've hurt before because we cannot bear to see them recover from our cruelty. The narcissist's final manipulation is a perfect embodiment of this principle. Your recovery threatens their narrative, the story they've told themselves about who you are and who they are in relation to you. If you can heal, if you can grow stronger, if you can see through their manipulation, then they must confront the uncomfortable truth about what they've done to you. So they attempt to make your healing the problem. They frame your growth as pathology, your strength as sickness, your clarity as confusion. They don't say, "I was wrong to hurt you." Instead, they say you were wrong to heal from it. But why does this work? Why do even the strongest among us sometimes find ourselves questioning our own recovery? The answer lies in what Viktor Frankl called existential guilt, that deep human tendency to feel responsible not just for our actions, but for our very existence. Those who've been manipulated often carry an unconscious belief that their pain somehow made them deserving of their treatment. When they finally break free, a part of them wonders if perhaps they don't deserve their freedom. The narcissist senses this vulnerability like a shark sensing blood in the water. They don't need to convince you that you're crazy. They just need to convince you that your sanity is somehow cruel. They don't need to prove that you're weak. They just need to suggest that your strength is somehow wrong. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the human tendency to deny our own freedom and responsibility. The narcissist's final manipulation is an attempt to convince you that your freedom from their control is itself a form of bad faith, that your responsibility to yourself is somehow a betrayal of your responsibility to them. They create what psychologists call a double bind, a situation where every possible response seems wrong. If you maintain your boundaries, you're cold and unforgiving. If you lower your boundaries, you're back under their control. If you try to explain your growth, you're being defensive. If you refuse to engage, you're being cruel. They've constructed a psychological maze where every path leads back to self-doubt. This is why understanding the philosophical roots of this manipulation is so crucial. This isn't just about personal psychology. It's about the fundamental human struggle between authentic selfhood and the crushing weight of others' expectations. The narcissist has learned to exploit one of our deepest existential fears, that in becoming ourselves, we might somehow become monstrous. Aldous Huxley warned us about this in his exploration of spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use growth and healing as a way to avoid the messy reality of human relationships. The narcissist weaponizes this concept, suggesting that your healing is just another form of avoidance, that your strength is just another form of weakness dressed up in spiritual language. But here's what they don't want you to understand. Your growth threatens them precisely because it's real. Your strength challenges them precisely because it's authentic. Your clarity disturbs them precisely because it illuminates their darkness. The question isn't whether you've become too strong. The question is whether you're strong enough to recognize that their question itself is the trap. But the true horror of this final manipulation isn't just what it does to you in the moment. It's how it seeps into the groundwater of your entire existence, contaminating every relationship, every decision, every moment of potential joy with the persistent whisper that perhaps you've gone too far. You begin to notice it first in small ways. You catch yourself apologizing for setting boundaries, not because you've done anything wrong, but because some part of you has internalized their suggestion that your strength is somehow excessive. You find yourself second-guessing moments of clarity, wondering if perhaps you're being too harsh, too unforgiving, too much. This is cognitive dissonance at its most insidious. Your rational mind knows that your growth is healthy, that your boundaries are necessary, that your clarity is a gift you've fought hard to earn. But your emotional mind has been infected with their poison, the idea that healing itself can be a form of cruelty, that strength itself can be a form of weakness. The neuroscience behind this is deeply disturbing. When we're subjected to this kind of psychological manipulation, our brains literally rewire themselves to accommodate the contradiction. The anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for conflict monitoring, becomes hyperactive as it tries to resolve the impossible equation. I am strong plus my strength is wrong equals. What exactly? Your nervous system begins to treat your own growth as a threat. Every moment of confidence triggers a subtle anxiety response. Every boundary you set activates the same neural pathways that once fired when you were genuinely in danger. Your body begins to fear your own healing, your own strength, your own clarity. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, but with a cruel twist. Traditional learned helplessness involves giving up because you believe you have no power. This is something far more sophisticated. Learned self-doubt about the power you've already claimed. You don't give up your strength. You simply learn to feel guilty about having it. The social consequences ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. You begin to preemptively soften your boundaries with others, not because they've done anything wrong, but because you've been conditioned to believe that firmness itself is somehow problematic. You find yourself over-explaining your decisions, over-justifying your needs, over-apologizing for taking up space in your own life. Friends and family members who've watched you grow stronger suddenly find themselves dealing with someone who seems to be regressing. Not because you've actually become weaker, but because you've learned to disguise your strength to avoid the accusation that you've become too much. You begin to perform a kind of psychological theater, playing a smaller version of yourself to avoid triggering others' discomfort with your growth. The confirmation bias kicks in with devastating efficiency. Every time someone seems uncomfortable with your boundaries, you interpret it as evidence that you've gone too far. Every time someone suggests you're being too sensitive or too rigid or too analytical, you file it away as proof that the narcissist was right, that your healing has somehow made you less human, less lovable, less worthy of connection. But here's the most insidious part. This manipulation doesn't just affect how you see yourself. It affects how you see other strong people. You begin to eye with suspicion anyone who seems too confident, too boundaried, too clear about what they will and won't accept. You've been infected with a narcissist's worldview, that strength is somehow suspicious, that clarity is somehow cold, that healing is somehow selfish. This creates a kind of psychological Stockholm syndrome where you begin to identify with your oppressor's values. You start to see weakness as more genuine than strength, confusion as more human than clarity, accommodation as more loving than boundaries. You've been conditioned to believe that your wounds made you more authentic than your healing ever could. The cultural implications are staggering. We live in a society that already struggles with the concept of healthy boundaries, that often mistakes accommodation for kindness and conflict avoidance for peace. When someone who's learned to be strong begins to question that strength, they become an unwitting ambassador for dysfunction, modeling to others that perhaps growth itself is the problem. You begin to police not just your own healing, but others as well. When you see someone set a firm boundary, part of you wonders if they're being too harsh. When you witness someone refuse to engage with manipulation, part of you questions whether they're being too rigid. You've become an agent of the very system you fought so hard to escape. The economic consequences are equally profound. People who've learned to doubt their own strength often find themselves accepting less than they deserve. In relationships, in careers, in life itself. They negotiate from a position of apologetic weakness rather than confident strength, because they've been conditioned to believe that confidence itself is somehow problematic. Your decision-making becomes paralyzed by the constant internal dialogue. Am I being too strong? Too rigid? Too unforgiving? You begin to make choices not based on what's best for you, but based on what will generate the least criticism from others. You've traded your hard-won clarity for the false peace of universal approval. But perhaps most tragically, you begin to lose access to your own intuition, that quiet voice that once guided you out of the darkness. Every time your inner wisdom suggests a boundary or a decision that might be perceived as too much, you silence it. You've learned to fear your own instincts, to question your own perceptions, to doubt your own recovery. The narcissist doesn't need to be present anymore. They've installed a representative of their worldview directly into your psyche. A voice that constantly whispers that your strength is somehow wrong, that your healing is somehow selfish, that your clarity is somehow cruel. This is how they win, even when they lose. This is how they maintain control, even after you've walked away. This is how they ensure that your freedom from them is never complete, because you'll spend years questioning whether you deserve to be free at all. The cage is no longer external. You've learned to build it from the inside. But here's what the narcissist never counted on. The very fact that you're questioning your strength proves that your strength is real. Their manipulation only works because you've actually grown beyond their reach. A truly weak person wouldn't inspire this level of desperate psychological warfare. A truly broken person wouldn't pose enough of a threat to warrant such sophisticated manipulation. The rebellion begins with a radical reframe. What if your discomfort with your own strength isn't evidence that you've gone too far, but evidence that you're breaking free from a system designed to keep you small? Think about it. Every totalitarian regime in history has used the same tactic. They convince the oppressed that their desire for freedom is actually a form of selfishness, that their strength is actually a form of cruelty, that their clarity is actually a form of delusion. The narcissist is simply applying this principle on a personal level. Your rebellion starts with recognizing that healthy people don't make others feel guilty for healing. Healthy people don't suggest that your boundaries are evidence of your coldness. Healthy people don't mourn the wounded version of yourself that was easier to manipulate. When someone consistently makes you feel guilty for growing stronger, you're not dealing with someone who loves you. You're dealing with someone who loves their ability to control you. The first act of rebellion is to stop treating your strength as a hypothesis to be tested. You don't need to prove that your boundaries are justified. You don't need to demonstrate that your clarity is earned. You don't need to defend your right to heal from the damage they caused. Your strength doesn't require anyone else's approval to be valid. Consider the radical possibility that the narcissist's discomfort with your growth is actually confirmation that you're on the right path. Like a vampire recoiling from sunlight, their reaction to your strength tells you everything you need to know about the nature of that strength. They wouldn't work so hard to convince you it's wrong if it wasn't actually threatening to their ability to manipulate you. The rebellion deepens when you begin to see their final manipulation for what it really is, a compliment wrapped in an insult. They're essentially saying, "You've become so strong that I can no longer control you, and this threatens my entire worldview." What they frame as your failure is actually your greatest success. But rebellion isn't just about recognizing the manipulation. It's about actively choosing to honor your growth despite their attempts to shame you for it. This means making decisions based on your own values rather than their comfort level. It means setting boundaries without lengthy justifications. It means refusing to shrink yourself to make others feel better about their own lack of growth. The most powerful form of rebellion is what psychologists call radical acceptance. Not just accepting your strength, but celebrating it. You've earned every ounce of clarity you possess. You've fought for every boundary you've set. You've paid for your healing with your own blood, sweat, and tears. No one has the right to make you feel guilty for what you've legitimately earned. Historical examples illuminate this principle beautifully. Every civil rights leader faced the same accusation, that their strength was somehow excessive, that their demands were somehow unreasonable, that their refusal to accept injustice was somehow divisive. Martin Luther King Jr. was called too radical by moderate whites who preferred the peaceful oppression of the status quo to the uncomfortable process of change. Your narcissist is using the same playbook, just on a personal scale. The rebellion requires you to become comfortable with being misunderstood by those who benefit from your weakness. Not everyone will celebrate your growth. Not everyone will understand your boundaries. Not everyone will appreciate your clarity. And that's not your problem to solve. You must develop what I call strategic selfishness, the willingness to prioritize your own healing over others' comfort with that healing. This isn't cruelty, it's survival. You cannot heal in an environment that punishes healing. You cannot grow in a space that shames growth. You cannot become strong in a relationship that requires you to remain weak. The rebellion also involves learning to distinguish between healthy guilt and manipulative guilt. Healthy guilt emerges when you've actually done something wrong, when you violated your own values or hurt someone unnecessarily. Manipulative guilt emerges when you've done something right, when you've honored your values or protected yourself from harm. If you feel guilty for setting boundaries, saying no, or refusing to engage with manipulation, you're experiencing manipulative guilt, and it's a sign that you're moving in the right direction. But perhaps the most radical act of rebellion is learning to trust your own experience over others' interpretations of your experience. You are the expert on your own life. You are the authority on your own healing. You are the final judge of your own growth. When someone tries to convince you that your healing is actually wounding, that your strength is actually weakness, that your clarity is actually confusion, you have the right to say, "I disagree, and my disagreement is final." The rebellion reaches its crescendo when you realize that you don't need to convince anyone else that your strength is justified. You don't need to prove to the narcissist that your boundaries are reasonable. You don't need to demonstrate to skeptics that your healing is genuine. Your strength speaks for itself, and those who can't hear it weren't meant to be in your life anyway. This is the ultimate act of rebellion. Living as if your growth is not up for debate, because it isn't. Living as if your strength is not a hypothesis to be tested, because it isn't. Living as if your healing is not a privilege to be earned, because it isn't. Your rebellion becomes complete when you stop asking permission to be who you've become and start demanding that others adjust to your growth, rather than expecting you to shrink to accommodate their comfort. The narcissist's final manipulation only works if you believe that your strength is somehow wrong. The moment you embrace your strength as not just right, but necessary, their power over you dies completely. And now we arrive at the deepest truth, the one that changes everything. The narcissist's final manipulation isn't actually about you at all. It's about them confronting the terrifying reality that they are no longer the main character in your story. For years, perhaps decades, you existed primarily as a supporting character in their narrative. Your pain validated their power. Your confusion confirmed their superiority. Your weakness enabled their strength. But when you grew strong enough to see through their manipulation, you did something that shattered their entire worldview. You became the protagonist of your own life. This is what they cannot forgive. This is what they cannot accept. This is what drives them to attempt this final, desperate manipulation. Because when you step into your own power, you reveal the devastating truth about their existence. That they're not the brilliant manipulator they believe themselves to be, but a broken person who can only feel strong by making others feel weak. The ultimate realization is this: their attempt to make you question your strength is actually the final proof of that strength. Like a dying star that burns brightest just before it collapses, their manipulation becomes most intense precisely when it's about to become completely powerless. You see, there's a moment in every healing journey when you cross an invisible threshold. Before this moment, you might doubt your perceptions, question your memories, or wonder if perhaps you're being too sensitive. But after this moment, their manipulation bounces off you like arrows off armor. You've developed what ancient philosophers called ataraxia, an unshakable inner peace that cannot be disturbed by external chaos. This terrifies them because it means they can no longer access your emotional core. They can no longer make you doubt what you know to be true. They can no longer convince you that your healing is somehow wrong. They've lost the ability to colonize your mind with their version of reality. But here's the most profound realization. When you finally see through their final manipulation, you don't just free yourself from them. You free yourself from the entire system of thought that made their manipulation possible in the first place. You break free from the cultural programming that teaches us to doubt our own strength, to question our own healing, to apologize for our own growth. You begin to understand that the voice that whispers, "Maybe you've gone too far," isn't your intuition. It's the internalized voice of every person who ever benefited from your weakness. It's the echo of every system that taught you to be small, every relationship that required you to be wounded, every environment that punished your authenticity. The ultimate truth is that your strength was never the problem. The problem was living in a world that couldn't handle your strength. The problem was surrounding yourself with people who needed you to be weak to feel strong themselves. The problem was believing that your healing was somehow negotiable, that your growth was somehow optional, that your strength was somehow wrong. When you finally embrace this truth, something magical happens. You stop explaining yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand you. You stop justifying your boundaries to those who benefit from their absence. You stop apologizing for taking up space in your own life. You stop performing weakness to make others comfortable with your strength. And in that moment of complete self-acceptance, you realize that the narcissist's final manipulation was actually a gift in disguise. By forcing you to question your strength, they forced you to examine it, to test it, to prove to yourself that it was real. By attacking your right to heal, they forced you to defend that right, to claim it, to make it truly yours. You discover that true strength isn't the absence of doubt. It's the ability to act with integrity despite doubt. True healing isn't the absence of pain. It's the refusal to let pain define you. True growth isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to move forward despite fear. The narcissist's final manipulation becomes the catalyst for your final transformation. You stop being someone who has recovered from their abuse and become someone who has been refined by it. You stop being a survivor and become a thriver. You stop being someone who escaped their control and become someone who is always too powerful to be controlled. You just forgot for a while. This is the ultimate paradox. By trying to convince you that your strength is wrong, they give you the opportunity to prove to yourself that it's right. By questioning your healing, they force you to defend it so thoroughly that you become unshakable in your commitment to it. By attacking your growth, they provide the resistance that makes that growth even stronger. You realize that you're never too strong, too rigid, too unforgiving, or too much. You were exactly as strong as you needed to be to survive their manipulation. You were exactly as rigid as you needed to be to maintain your boundaries. You were exactly as unforgiving as you needed to be to protect your healing. You were exactly as much as you needed to be to reclaim your life. The final, most powerful realization is that their opinion of your strength was never relevant. What matters is that you found your way back to yourself, that you reclaimed your right to exist authentically, that you chose healing over comfortable dysfunction. You are not too strong. You are finally strong enough. You're not too much. You are finally enough. You are not too rigid. You are finally resilient. in their desperate attempt to convince you otherwise? That's just the sound of their power over you dying. Listen carefully. Can you hear it? That's the sound of freedom. Now step into it and never look back.